role on COVID, and in particular, I've been working as a special envoy on this new disease for the World Health Organization Director General. And that's why I'm glad that it's called COVID-Ready Cities, the importance of dialogue to shape resilient food systems. We're using these meta sessions to look at particular topics as well as constituencies within food systems. And today we're focusing on food systems and cities. I'm delighted that so many of you who do come from all sorts of different facets of food systems are joining us. You're also all part of the food systems dialogue community, and that's so good. Some of you perhaps don't know very much about the food systems dialogues. And so what I'm going to do in a second is just give you a very short introduction so that you know what it is we've been doing. Meanwhile, I'd also like to recognize representatives from the partners in the food systems dialogues movement, and as well as representatives from the many different cities networks that are here with us as well. I'd like to particularly single out our guest speakers, Councillor Paulette Hamilton from Birmingham in the UK, David Jácome from Quito in Ecuador, and Rotem Ayalon, who comes from Montreal in Canada. We'd like you, if you can, to turn on your camera, but perhaps to be muted unless you are speaking. We've usually found that it works best in these kinds of webinars if you send us an email to info@foodsystemsdialogues.org, and the food systems dialogues are all one word. You send us an email if you want to ask a question. We also encourage you to use the chat, but because we've got people scanning this email address, they are well able to pick up quickly if there's something you want to do, and they can then share it with me because I'll be your moderator for the next 55 minutes, helping to guide us through this webinar. And if we can use that technique, we've found in the past that it leads to quite an exciting energy of discussion. So let me just give a very short introduction to, I'll make sure, thank you for putting this, I'll make sure we put the email address into the chat. Look, I'll do it myself now, just to show you that I am following you. There you are. You can see how quickly or not I can type. info@foodsystemsdialogues.org. Just check it's spelled right. So I'm going to start with just some introductory remarks from me as the curator of the food systems dialogues process. And it gives me actually huge pleasure to do this. We started the food systems dialogues just over 2 years ago. And it was actually an initiative by Peter Backer of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, Gunhild Stordalen of the EAT Foundation, and Dominic Warre of the World Economic Forum. And coming together and saying, it's great that we want to see transformation in food systems, but one of the challenges seems to be that each time you get people with different professional or institutional perspectives looking at food systems, they find it very hard to then accommodate the perspectives of others. It was as though work to try to look for improving food systems always gets tied up and indeed, frankly, undermined by people's strong and often entrenched positions based on their profession, their affiliation, or simply their experience. And so the original idea from these three people who came together was, couldn't we create an environment in which really there was more focus on dialogue between different actors working on food systems, so they could explore with each other whether there's room to align their perspectives and shift their approach to changing food systems. Now, the people who had this original discussion were the first to understand that there are extraordinary power structures in food systems, and that these power structures create an environment that restricts the opportunity for position shifts so as to get food systems that are more nutritious or more sustainable or better for livelihoods or better for climate or better for trade or whatever else is required. But at the same time, they, based on experience in other areas, particularly climate and nature, they decided to press ahead and try to create a structured environment within which multiple stakeholders could come together and give themselves a chance of being able to shift position so that they could look at food systems differently and then take action that would have more far-reaching consequences. Well, that led to the conceptualization of food systems dialogues. And since those three organizations came together, two more organizations have joined, the Food and Land Use Coalition and the Global Alliance to Improve Nutrition. And I was asked to serve as the convener of these food systems dialogues and the curator of the process through which the discussions took place. I was supported by a secretariat that was set up by EAT in Oslo, and Anya Donahue, who's currently the manager of the Food Systems Dialogues Project, and Christina Pavlescu, who's just reaching the end of her time in the secretariat. She doesn't want to leave, but due to resource constraints, it's become necessary for her to move on. They are the secretariat. I am the curator. And between us, through working with lots of different actors around the world, we have been responsible for 34 different food systems dialogues events on 6 continents in 23 countries, with 2,034 participants going through them. And because these are very structured, these dialogues, with multiple stakeholders of very diverse kinds coming around tables for facilitated discussion, it's actually led to 236 firm proposals for action that will lead to transformed food systems. And then by crunching these together, we find that there are 10 red thread themes that have come through, which represent a growing body of ideas for food systems transformation. Of course, the arrival of COVID has actually given added urgency to this work, because it's shown how really important it is to move forward on equitable and sustainable, nutritious, climate-compatible food systems everywhere, particularly because COVID has shown up some of the weaknesses in our existing food systems, both from the perspective of the producers and the processors on one hand, including those working in meat and fish who are having particularly bad time COVID-wise, as well as smallholder farmers who are finding their markets have suddenly disappeared. And then on the other hand, poor people in particular, as well as children from poor households experiencing extreme food poverty, malnutrition, and also unable to be supported because the normal instruments that support them, particularly civil society groups, are actually finding it super hard to get the resources they need to do this work. So there's a lot of big issues to deal with that COVID has revealed. And that's why this conversation on looking at the role of cities in food systems is absolutely critical, particularly when we look at it from a COVID perspective. So what we're going to do now is briefly hear from our 3 speakers, each making 5-minute introductory remarks in the order of Councillor Hamilton, then David Jácome-Pólit, and then Rotem Ayalon. Each 5 minutes, I will very briefly introduce them before they do so with a single question. I will take the liberty of timing them, and I will tell them when their 5 minutes is up. As they respond, I'm inviting the speakers to reflect on what's happening in their city and also their experience with COVID-19. Then what I'm going to do is, after we've heard from each of the speakers, I'm then going to invite them to focus on specific issues. Some of these will be issues that you might bring up. Some of them will be issues that come up from their conversation. And then we will try towards the end to pull it all together. Remember, we've got a politician, we've got a city official, and what we call a representative of the third sector talking today. So we should have a very rich discussion. Let me start with Councillor Hamilton. And if it's okay, Councillor Hamilton, just a little bit of your background. You are a registered nurse, but you're also Cabinet Member for Health and Social Care for Birmingham City Council in the UK. In your portfolio, you're responsible for public health, healthy communities, action to combat domestic violence, and adult social care and health. You're said to be pretty passionate about food systems, but most importantly, as well as your personal passion, you've been leading numerous initiatives, not only locally, but also internationally, to address the breakdowns of food systems, and you've been particularly active during this time of COVID. So, Councillor Hamilton, we'd love to hear from you now. I'd like to give you the floor. Thank you very much indeed.
It's my absolute pleasure to be here this afternoon. As a politician, normally it would be officers that come along and speak on these subjects, because politicians tend to shy away from it sometimes. But I absolutely believe that the issues around food and the food system, if you don't get the interest from your politicians to lead and direct and drive it, you never get to the places you want to go. Now, let me start and talk a little bit about Birmingham. Birmingham is a city of 1.2 million people. It's a very diverse city. It's a very young city. And it's a city that at the beginning, over a number of years, we've been doing some joined up work with a city called Pune through the Food Foundation, where we've been looking at the food system and how food is not just, what was the word I use is, how does it go from the field to the plate? And within a city, how do we make that happen? And what are the restrictions from making that happen well? So what we were doing prior to COVID, we were in the middle of a consultation actually, where we went out on a big question and answer series, where we were looking at how do people eat food? What types of food do they eat? How do they get fresh food easily in a city? How do people that are living in poverty, what is their priorities? So we'd started that piece of work. We'd done some really important work with Pune to see what was happening in Pune. Why were they having people that were malnourished? And we were then seeing the same things in a city like Birmingham that was a first world country. So that's the context. There were many other things that we were doing because we were part of a trailblazer project looking at obesity within the city. We were looking at things around health inequality. We were looking at the issues around food poverty. So there was lots of things we were looking at. Then came COVID. COVID was COVID-19. It was like a bolt out of the heavens. It was like a tsunami on the city, because we have a very good public health director. We have a very good public health team. We have a very good senior leadership team. So they had started, when the first case was identified at Christmas in Wuhan, we in Birmingham had started that preparatory work around COVID-19. But the issue when the lockdown came on the 23rd of March, where people then were classed as clinically shielded, they needed to stay at home, they couldn't go out and buy food, people couldn't go to work, it made the situation even worse. Because what that meant was we as a system decided that we needed to feed people. But it wasn't Birmingham, it was a national policy. And as per usual, our national leaders didn't allow the local policy to drive. They tried to do it from the national level. What that led to in Birmingham was the first few weeks, even though we tried to provide food for our local community, because of the vast diversity, we have over 187 languages in our city. And because of the different faiths and religions, it was very difficult to give the people exactly what they wanted, like gluten-free diets, like diabetic diets, like low sugar products. But once it all kicked in, we were then able to work with our distributors to ensure that we tried to ensure that our people were fed in the right way. As a system, it still left loads of gaps because many of our people were not clinically shielded people. Many of our people were just people that fell through gaps because of unemployment, because of the situations they were in, and they could not manage. So we, at one point, we were feeding over 14,000 people each week. And in a system like Birmingham, it was a great deal of work, and we then had to rely predominantly with the finances from the local government, with the food given by national government. We had to rely on the voluntary sector, we had to rely on other organizations to help us get the food out there. But people are very resilient, and they did that quite quickly to get the food out there. The issue that we then found was the food poverty was far greater than we thought it was. We had issues around inequalities that the COVID just absolutely exacerbated. We had issues around people's health that COVID just exacerbated. So as a city, we struggled at first to get what we needed to people, but as the weeks went on, we were able to get what people needed, but in my humble opinion, not to the level that they actually were getting as much fresh fruit and vegetables as they need, that they were getting the cooked food of the absolute right type. It was just a matter of ensuring that people could eat and eat well. And it does work. But for me, as a food system, we needed to have done, and it's not our fault, it was the COVID-19, far more planning for the future. We need to look at the health inequalities. We needed to look at the fact that many of our people in Birmingham, we had issues with mental health issues, and because the diets became even poorer and the systems were not there, many of our shops were now closed, our small businesses, because we run on a mass independent businesses within the city. It all became very tough, but we did it. As a city, we managed to do it, but we still have now seen the absolute difficulties that there are out there, and we have some major problems around food poverty. And for me, if we are going to have a healthy city, we have to have a well-fed city. If we're going to have, if we're going to look at health inequalities, we've got to look at where people live. We've got to look at education. We've got to look at employment. We've got to look at how can people actually cook. If you're in a home for 13 or 14 weeks, can you actually cook the food to sustain you? So for me, I don't know if I'm asking more questions than I'm answering, but what we did in Birmingham we had to then do things quite quickly. But what it's helped us to do is really pinpoint some of those pivotal issues that we can now take forward and work with the system to address, especially, and this is where I'll stop, among our elderly, very young, the absolute vulnerable that are out there. And because many of them have been isolated for over 3 months, the issues that have then been caused because of it. Now, I know I've brought a lot of things into that, but I hope you can see that as a system, we had a lot of issues going into this, but this has helped us to really focus on where we need to do some of our work going forward. Thank you.
Stunning, short and very clear observations. I'm sure everybody has picked out quite a lot from what you've said. I'd like to call you Paulette, if I may.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Thank you. I hope that people have been picking out some of the gems. Here's the gems that I picked out as you were speaking. You realize that it's a lot of work, and you did something extraordinary, finding a way to feed 14,000 people each week. You also saw that inequality was just so profound, and that unless you could address inequalities, particularly when it came to food, you couldn't help the people of Birmingham to be strong in the face of their COVID. And you said there's so much being revealed and exacerbated by COVID. It must have been very disturbing for you. And then you said you did the best you could, but you found that there were many ways in which you could have done better. For example, looking at the needs of older people, looking at mental health issues, and then also going to the very vulnerable people who just didn't have the capacity to cook. I don't know what anybody else thought, but I found that really important. In this kind of work, we're always learning and always seeing what better we can do. So Paulette, if it's okay, I'll now move on to our next speaker, and then we'll come back and invite you to say some more. And I'm sure there'll be questions, because that was so rich. So now David Jácome-Pólit, and I hope I pronounced that right, is going to speak. He's Director of Resilience for the Municipality of Quito in Ecuador. He's also Director, as well as being Director of Resilience, he's also very important in looking across other cities to help them with their resilience work. He's got all sorts of degrees in agricultural engineering, technology, and sustainable development from Delft in the Netherlands. What we'd like to hear is about the work that you're doing in Quito, and also in particular about how COVID has impacted on food systems in your city. And you've got the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Arne, for inviting me here. And I'm very glad to be able to tell you about the work that we have been doing here in Quito, and how it has helped us to face the challenges derived from the pandemic. So I would like just to refer to 3 points. The journey that we've been taking so far in terms of strengthening the food system of the city. What is our understanding of how to make it stronger and better, and to work best, especially for the most vulnerable, and how that process and how that understanding has been of help when facing the pandemic. So the journey starts somewhere around the beginning of the 2000s, when the participatory urban farming program of the city started under the leadership of Alexandra Rodriguez, and it has been maintained so far until now. And I think that was one of the first steps of the city to really address food issues.
David, if you can hear me,
yes.
Try and talk a bit closer to your microphone. It's very directionally sensitive. Just thank you very much. Sorry to trouble you.
No, it's okay. I'll get closer to the computer in that case. So as I was mentioning, the journey starts with a participatory urban farming program of the city Agrupar under the leadership of Alexandra Rodriguez. And I think that was the way how the city and the municipality of Quito started thinking about food and food systems and the food agenda as part of the urban planning of the city and as part of the socio-economic inclusiveness of people. Later on, in 2017, we launched the resilience strategy of the city, where the food economy was one of the main pillars of the resilience strategy, especially when we understood that we have almost half of the population that is quite young, let's say below 30 years old, and that they need to be incorporated into the productive sector of the city. Then food becomes an important issue. At the same time, in 2017, the Agri-Food Pact of the city of Quito was created, which is basically an agreement or a covenant between, let's say, around 30 organizations in the city that they all range from consumers and waste disposal to producers. So that's how we connect all these different actors. And we have around 1,600 signatories for the pact. In 2018, we launched the agri-food system, the agri-food strategy. And right now we are implementing, we are working into the resilience strategy of the whole food system of the city. I have to say, in all this journey, the RAP Foundation and Recolto, and of course the Water, Land and Ecosystem Program have been of quite help, because they have provided technical assistance and insights and inputs to all this work. So as we started working with regards to the strengthening the food system of the city of Quito, basically building resilience, one of the first steps was to, on one hand, understand the system. We actually drew the system, and you can find that published in ISOCARP, which is basically an urban development magazine. And we understood by drawing the system, what are the different relationships, for example, between private markets and public markets, and why people, especially the most vulnerable, they do not have such an easy way to access to food, and so on. And the other point was to understand how well the food system was working. And in order to do that, we took the food security concept, which is well known, and we broke it down into different pieces. We understood in that way by analyzing data and information. For example, how hard is it for people to access to food from an economic point of view, but also from an urban point of view? Or how vulnerable the whole food chain of the city is, and why is it vulnerable? We also analyzed what were the underlying problems behind the biological use of food. We have obesity and we have undernutrition as two problems happening at the same time in the city of Quito. But also we analyzed the risk management system, either from the city or from the country. And as a result, we have some kind of chart right now that we can plan accordingly so that we can strengthen all these different aspects that I just mentioned. They are around 40 factors. And then, so we have a pretty interesting set of strategies. When it comes to COVID-19, it was interesting to see that from all these 40 factors, the ones that we identified as the ones that were creating food insecurity in the city are the ones that are impacted the most by the emergency. And the factors that were working better, for example, the urban farming program of the city, or the food bank of the city, or the citizen participation scheme of the city, they were actually helping the city to face the challenges of bringing food to the people. And this is what is quite interesting, and it's the fact that when a system works properly before a disruptive event, it can help cities to face these events and even better come successful. So when it comes to food provision, the urban farming program has been of quite help. It not only made possible for around 1,600 families to stay indoors because they had some of the food that they needed, and they needed to go out to the streets to sell goods and then buy food, which is actually happening in the city. But also they were able to provide fresh local produced food for other people, around 11 tons per week. When it comes to the food bank, well, it has been quite remarkable to see how around the food bank, different actors, especially from the private sector, have been able to channelize food, especially for the most vulnerable as well, because of how well the food bank has been working. And finally, through the citizen participation program, it has been quite interesting to see how neighborhood leaders are able to connect these efforts from the municipality of Quito or the food bank with people in neighborhoods, especially the most vulnerable ones, because they are the ones who actually know what's going on in the neighborhoods in a way, in a very granular way. So we know where does the ones who are not able to leave their houses to get food because they are sick or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is that these are processes that also comes from our understanding of the food system and what makes it vulnerable. Also, what needs to be strengthened, and also taking advantage of these different activities that have been definitely important in the city's response. And I think I'm going to stop there.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, David. It was lovely the way in which you described how understanding the way in which the systems are working and being able to dissect out the vulnerabilities enabled you to find ways to directly enable 1.6K families to be more resilient and able to actually stay indoors and avoid being exposed. That's beautiful. Thank you very much indeed. And now I'd like to go to our third speaker, Rotem Ayalon. Now, Rotem is currently a partnership strategist with Centraide of Greater Montreal, which is a collective action project working in the most vulnerable communities in her city. She's also founding member of the first Food Policy Council in Quebec. She's from McGill, as well as from Cornell. How's COVID impacted on food systems in Montreal? You have the floor.
Hi, thank you. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. I think like every city, COVID has impacted us greatly. I think, well, Montreal specifically, we're a region of around 3 million people, and we've been the hardest hit in Canada from COVID-19. And I think the history of community activism and collective action has been what's helped us. It's been our saving grace, I think, in being able to react quickly. So I won't go through all the history of Montreal, but we have a unique model of neighborhood roundtables. So in all of the 31 neighborhoods or boroughs in the city, there's an instance called a community roundtable that is over 30 years, has a history over 30 years of activism, and it gathers together all the instances in the neighborhood, including the municipal, local borough council members, community organizations, schools, community daycares, all representatives of different sectors, and they've been practicing working together around different issues. And I think COVID has been an instance that has revealed that thanks to this collaboration and practice working together, they've been able to quickly react and respond to the needs of the most vulnerable population. So regarding food emergency, we've been able to rapidly, with collaboration from the city center, respond to the needs and work on delivering food to the most vulnerable populations. And the city center has created, emergency task forces in connection with each of the boroughs, each of the neighborhood roundtables, and communication is the key. We've been really having to work nonstop, and the community sector, the third sector, has been working day and night, as along with supermarkets and hospital workers. They are on the ground in constant contact with senior citizens and new immigrants, people who have lost their jobs and have been working to feed the most needy. We've seen for sure an increase in people accessing food banks, and so we've had to work quickly to respond to those needs. I work for Centraide, or the United Way, and we have been able to help funnel funding from the federal government down quickly to the community organizations who are responding to the needs of the individuals who have had difficulty feeding themselves. But we've seen a great resurgence of interest by the private sector and citizens, great creativity. One initiative I'd like to highlight is during the pandemic, when all of the restaurants were closed, chefs in our city had banded together, and with support from the philanthropic sector, from the agricultural sector, with donations of, for example, milk and food products that weren't being used when restaurants were closed, worked to create over 4,000 meals per week to be delivered to senior citizens and the most vulnerable populations, delivered by community organizations by bicycle throughout the city and the region. And so we saw chefs being able to work and be of use, and this was a great which is a great pride in Quebec. So not just in Montreal, but all around Quebec, the meals were delivered. We see citizens taking an interest again in gardening and cooking. The city and the public health department worked hard to reopen community gardens quickly, respecting social distancing measures. We also saw our city's botanical garden dedicate a large portion of its surface area to produce fruits and vegetables this year that will be delivered and distributed by community organizations and food banks. We also worked quickly with the city and with community organizations to prepare meals for homeless people, and really make a large effort in the neighborhood plazas, in the city plazas, to shut them down and use them to create spaces for homeless to eat and to have safe spaces to sleep and have access to bathrooms. So I think. And I guess the last thing I'll close with is Montreal has a long history also of work around the food system. We recently formed a food policy council, but we've had many years of practice working around the food system. Donc, we have a Conseil du Système Alimentaire. It's our food policy council, but we've always looked at it from the food systems angle and have try to incorporate all aspects of the food system. And I think I can respond to many other questions. I wanted to keep it short in my introduction, but we see what I think is inspiring is involvement from all levels of government and from all sectors around COVID-19. And I have a lot of hope for the future that we're going to just build on this experience and improve and just get better and realize that all of the difficulties, the inequalities that have been exacerbated by COVID-19 are just going to be addressed further after this.
Thank you very much indeed. Really, really interesting. And I'm just going to make a couple of comments, Rotem, after what you just said. Firstly, you had a history of collective action. And in fact, David and Paulette were also talking about the fact that there has been work underway. So they didn't have to invent things from scratch. You were anticipating there would be needs, each of you, and you moved quickly to find who were the vulnerable and to anticipate indeed that there would be certain groups who would be particularly vulnerable. Rotem, it was interesting that you connected together the needs of people who were homeless. You wanted them to be able to access bathrooms. So many cities have closed bathrooms and other facilities that are used by homeless people, which has actually compounded the situation for them. You had groups of actors who were ready to respond, each of you coming, either whether you were political or you were acting as an official or as a third sector person, you were bringing people together. It's interesting that in each case, you had to try to get the federal staff and resources and get it to where it was really needed. And it suggested that Paulette was finding that quite hard at 1 or 2 points in the way she spoke. David seemed to have some facilities for doing so. And you were saying, Rotem, that you did need to work to get the finance to where it was needed. You've all been learning while doing, and you're all saying you want to do better. And I suppose all I would say is that I don't think COVID's going away in a hurry. And I think it's going to have resurgences all over the place. So I think we need to be very much learning while doing and creating viable platforms. So our friend Gunther Hemrich, Gunther is here. He's from the Food and Agriculture Organization. Gunther, if you can unmute yourself, that would be really nice. Just in a minute or so, could you just say the comment you've sent through on the chat? Gunther.
Yes, I just have a question in terms of what does COVID reveal about the linkages between rural areas and the cities? We don't only look at the cities, but we look at the cities, how they are connected to the rural areas. And can you give a little bit more insight in terms of what worked and what were some of the, let's say, key insights that show action for the future?
Okay. What I'm going to do is to invite 2 or 3 questions and then go to the panelists, inviting them to reply. Let's see if we can actually do 2 rounds. It's a bit of a heroic attempt, but so if there are more questions that you have, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Let's go to John Ashlin. John Ashlin. I hope I pronounced you right. There you are, John. I can see you. John, if you'd introduce yourself and make your comment, that would be great.
Oh yeah, hello there. So I'm based in the UK, but I represent a Dutch NGO called Circle Economy. And I was just interested to know what experience or case studies participants can share around artist-led community dialogues related to sustainable food for vulnerable groups, also community empowerment and social learning, because I think there's a role for artists in this as well. I'm just interested to learn from your experience. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Presumably you have some experience of this, and so depending on what happens, it'd be nice to hear from you as well. But that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And by the way, everybody, this is a first attempt where all of us are going to be doing a lot of work on food and cities, particularly in the run-up to the World Food Summit 2021. So we'll have lots more opportunities for conversations. Does anybody else want to make a quick comment? I haven't got any more questions in, but I'm going to just look. Here's Louise. Louise, I can see you've asked a question. I'm looking for you to ask you to unmute yourself. Perhaps if it's easy for you, could you unmute yourself and come in? This is Louise.
Thank you, David. So my question really goes to all speakers. Your presentations were really interesting, and I was wondering about the processes pre-COVID that you're all referencing, and specifically, how did each city place food at the heart of planning in these cities? So really from a policy-making perspective, looking also for lessons that maybe other cities could copy in placing food at the centre of urban planning, and helping policymakers do that. Thank you.
So we have 3 things then from Louise. What were the elements there beforehand that were useful? From Gunther, what are you learning through COVID as a result of linkages between cities and rural areas? And indeed, could they be strengthened or changed? And then from John, have you got any experience of artist-led community dialogues? Paulette, would you like to have the first go? That's okay by you.
I'll have the first go, but I don't know if I will say anything new really. Right, the linkages between cities and rural. I thought that was a good point because Birmingham is surrounded by rural, by very much countryside, very rural type outskirts, and we work quite closely with other areas within the West Midlands to bring things in. But during the lockdown, because of the way the lockdown was done, it became far more difficult. So we had to work with organisations like Fair Share in Birmingham, or Breaks, another company that helped us to distribute food, or with local supermarkets, which I won't name. Do you see what I mean? So there wasn't enough developed in the city that we could actually say that we could just move to going from the rural to city. So we did find that at times we had shortages of different things. Now, artist learning, a case study, I'm not saying there isn't one out there, but I just cannot think of one. So I'm not going to harp on about it because I couldn't think of anything that I could help to help that question. And how did each city place food at the centre? I felt because of the work that we were doing with Pune and with the Food Foundation, actually putting food at the centre, and also with the university and local community groups to start to look at different ways, how they think of food, how they grow food, how they cook food, and how they see food. I actually believe we were starting to make those movements also within Birmingham. If you ever come to Birmingham, it's a very lively city, but food is at the centre of everything we do. So socially in Birmingham, everything you do, as you would in Italy, you do it around food through many of the different food places. We've got somewhere called in Digbeth that it's just really has been established, where it's for food connoisseurs and it's done at quite cheap rates. So I do believe that question, how does each city place food at the centre? It was at the centre, but the problem in Birmingham, and perhaps this is a negative with a positive, not everybody could afford it. So even though we had a very vibrant Asian market, we've got a very vibrant Chinese market, not everybody could afford to access the food, but the markets were there, and we just needed to do the education, how to do it at a cheaper rate. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
For stressing the point that we sometimes don't say to each other, that this is still super hard for a lot of people to afford. Thank you, Paulette. Really important. David, do you want to comment on some or all of what people have said?
Sure. Thank you. Well, I would like to refer first to the third question regarding the pre-COVID food policy. And also, what are the efforts right now that are being done by the city to incorporate the food agenda into the city development plan? Well, I think it was a great start to have included in the resilience strategy of the city the food economy, because we were really able to put on the table these issues that at least in Quito, they have been overlooked when planning for the development of the city. The food pact of the city of Quito has been quite of a partner, especially for the technicians behind all of this planning, because they've been able to provide support and to raise their voices to help put the agenda again on the table. The other point is that right now the city of Quito, the municipality of Quito, is redesigning the whole development plan of the city and the land use plan of the city. And now you can really see efforts from the Secretary of Territory, which is basically the urban planning agency in the municipality of Quito, to really give the importance to the food agenda in these two instruments. And this is quite important, especially because the development plan of the city of Quito is the one that allows to allocate public resources in different programs and projects. So this is crucial. This is something that we are doing. We are able to provide all these different programs and projects to be included in the development plan because we've been working in them for quite some time now. And I think we are going down the right path in that sense. When it comes to urban and rural linkages, which I think it's a very important question. Here in Quito, we have very long food supply chains, and it is quite a social phenomenon here, not easy to handle, because you have, I don't want to call them mobs or whatever, but you have people that are really entrenched in how the food is being supplied into the city. And those social dynamics are not easy to deal with. What has happened right now with the COVID-19 is that, and this comes especially from my observations, I live in the city center of Quito, in the historic center, which is basically a pretty popular place, in the sense that you have a lot of vulnerable population, indigenous, and also brothers and sisters from Venezuela that are migrants. So it's a pretty interesting place to see how these dynamics change because of the pandemic. And now what you can see is that some of the people that would sell their goods at the Mercado de San Roque market, which is one of the main markets in the city of Quito, and it's related physically to the city center. Some of these people are selling actually their goods in a scattered way in the city, and basically they are selling directly, in some cases, from producers. So the whole emergency has enabled and has forced at some point to reduce the supply chains and for these same actors and people to rethink the way of distributing and selling food. And like I was saying before, this is just an observation, but I think this is that we can learn from to improve the whole system. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much, David. I'm just going to move on quickly to Rotem. If you could just make a couple of comments. Then what I'm going to do is to take just some remarks from Charlotte Dufour and Crispin Cayetare, and then we'll have to stop just because we ran out of time. But I do want to try to get as many people as possible. So Rotem, if you want to come in now.
Great. Yeah, I'll respond to the linkages between rural and urban areas. That's the question I can talk about. Canada, I guess, and Montreal specifically, we generally don't worry about running out of food. Canada is one of those countries that we have enough food, we're not worried about it running out. But with the crisis, one thing that was brought to the surface was our dependence on seasonal foreign farm laborers. And when the border was closed between the US and Canada, suddenly we realized that farmers could have a problem, and we could start having a problem not getting the crops into the field in time or harvested in time. so I think that we realized that this is one weak point in our food system that needs to be improved upon. The provincial government did react quite quickly and made it easier for foreign workers to cross the border and have obviously go through quarantine, but they allowed also. They created an incentive program for students from Quebec to work on farms in Quebec in rural areas, which normally isn't done. It normally isn't an attractive job for Quebecers to work on farms, but this summer it is, and hopefully that will continue in the future. That connection between urban citizens from urban areas working on farms. Another initiative that has been put in place is a system of coupons helping the most vulnerable populations purchase food from local markets, from farms in areas. So allowing them to kind of a food stamp system to purchase food from local markets.
That's brilliant to see those two examples of change. And I think we're going to see more. So Crispin Kayatari, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to speak just what you've just written to me. Crispin, can you unmute yourself and talk? You're on mute.
Yeah,
now,
okay.
30 seconds, thank you.
Yes, I think you hear me well. And then my question was to see if the fragility of the traditional food system that proven by the COVID, what the action should we take in order to reshape the food system? That was my concern.
Right, so we're not going to be able to get an answer to this because of no time, but I wanted to hear from Crispin, who's a student in a master's program, and he's also doing an internship with the World Farmers Organization. Thank you very much indeed, Crispin, for making that point, that really what are the actions that are being taken to counter fragility. And Charlotte Dufour, please, from an entity called Narayan. Charlotte, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David. Actually, Rotem partly answered my question. I was wondering if there are some examples of the solidarity and changes that have occurred in response to COVID that have a chance of triggering longer-term systemic change in our food systems. I know it's a complex question, but maybe the reflection here is how can we use this crisis as an opportunity to drive systemic changes that are maybe more difficult in a business as usual scenario. But thanks to all these speakers for great lessons.
Now I want to go to Arnie O'Donoghue, who's the manager of the Food Systems Dialogues Programme, just to give him a chance to make any final comments. But before I do that, there's somebody I really would like to give a shout out to, Camille from Delice, who helped us to organise this session. Camille, where are you? Where are you? Rebecca's nodding her head in agreement.
Hi, David. Hello, everyone.
There you are. Do you want to say anything before we close, just in the last 30 seconds or so?
Well, first of all, we decided to hold this session after hearing a food systems dialogue in the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact Summit in Montpellier last year. And the Delice Network gathers 32 worldwide cities who believe that food can make a difference in terms of city attractiveness, economic development, sustainable development in urban environments. And all of our cities are very involved and engaged in that sector. And getting the Delice cities involved in this global project that is the Food System Dialogues was essential. And I'm happy we were able to have this call today and see some examples of two actually of Delice cities, because Birmingham and Montreal are both part of our network. And very interesting to hear about Quito. So thank you, David, and hopefully we can keep collaborating, and I'll be happy to present the network to any other interested cities. Thank you so
much indeed, Camille. It was really wonderful, the way in which you just said, I want this to happen. Please, everybody look in the chat. Arnie, did you want to say anything before we close?
No, just good afternoon to everybody, and just massive thanks to our three speakers, to Councillor Hamilton, to David, and not least to Rotem in Montreal. If any of you have any questions, connect with us at the Secretariat, info@foodsystemsdialogues.org. Those of you who've requested to be added to our reference group will receive invitations to that shortly. This session has been recorded and will also be available on our YouTube channel very shortly. Thank you all.
Thank you. So everybody, here we are seeing once again the power of dialogues, always connecting to people who we haven't connected to before, always exploring to make our systems view bigger, because we know that the issues we're dealing with require a systems mindset, but we also know that to get a full systems mindset, we need to be unlocking ourselves from the constraints of thinking in terms of disciplines or sectors or institutions. The more wider we can be in our thinking, the more empowered we are to address these massive challenges, even though sometimes they seem to be so hard to resolve. You heard today from Paulette, you heard today from David, you heard today from Rotem, and you can tell that these are people who believe in the power of connections. They believe in the capacity of people working together to find solutions. They're not frightened of operating in the political arena. They're not frightened of linking across disciplines. They're not frightened of building on partnerships to make something much stronger. This is what we believe in, and this is what we're all working for. Thank you for sparing so much of your time. And with this, on behalf of everybody, I say goodbye, and I thank you all.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paulette. Thank you, David. Thank you, Rotem. Thank you very much, Camille and Arnie and Christina. Thank you, Florence, supporting me here, and everybody else. Bye-bye.